My parents limited me to 100 words per day. 20 years later, they tried to silence my daughter. My parents had a rule when I was growing up that I have never been able to explain to anyone without watching their face change, which is that I was allowed 100 words a day, out loud, to them, total, and they counted. They called it teaching discipline of speech. They had a whole philosophy about how children today were overindulged in expression, and my father kept a little tally counter clipped to his belt, and he clicked it every time I spoke. And when I hit 100, I was silent until the next morning. And if I went over, there were consequences I'd rather not relive. You learn things growing up like that. You learn to make words count. You learn to write because the page didn't count against the tally. So I filled notebooks. An entire silent childhood poured into paper because it was the only place I was allowed to be a person without a limit. You also learn a particular kind of rage, the slow kind, the kind that goes underground and builds a foundation. I left at 18, built a life loud with words, became a writer, and kept my parents at the careful distance you keep people who hurt you in ways that are hard to make others believe. Then I had my daughter, Marin, who came out of the womb talking and never stopped. A kid so verbal and bright that watching her sometimes brings tears to my eyes because she is everything I wasn't allowed to be. I kept my parents at arm's length from her too, supervised visits only, because I didn't trust the philosophy hadn't gone dormant. I was right not to. Last month I had to travel 4 days for work, and the childcare that fell through last minute meant my mother offered to stay with Marin, and against every instinct I said yes, because surely 20 years and a lot of therapy and one clear conversation about boundaries would be enough. It was not enough. The dumber she thinks I am, the more rope she'll hand me. I called every night and Marin sounded off, quieter each call, and on the third night she barely spoke. And when I asked her what was wrong, she said in a whisper, "I used up my words, mommy," and the floor dropped out of the world. I kept my voice steady. I asked her what she meant, and my 7-year-old daughter explained to me, in a hushed voice like she was confessing a crime, that grandma had a rule now, that good girls only got so many words, that grandma had a clicker, that Marin had talked too much, and wasn't allowed to talk anymore tonight, and I could hear my mother in the background. And I understood that the thing that had been done to me, the thing I had spent 20 years trying to heal, my mother had simply carried into my own house and started doing to my child, in 3 days, the second I turned my back. I did not scream. I have learned from the silence to be very controlled when it counts. I told Marin that grandma's rule was never real, that she could use all the words in the world, and I would never run out of wanting to hear them. And I told her to go put grandma's clicker in the freezer, which made her laugh, the first laugh in 3 days. And then I booked a first flight home and called my husband, who was closer, and told him to go get our daughter that night, and he did. When I walked in the next morning, my mother was sitting at the table with the posture of a woman who knew what she'd done and had decided to be wounded about it. And before I could say a word, she said, "I was helping. She's wild. You let her run wild. Someone has to teach her." And I looked at the woman who had counted my childhood out 100 words at a time, and I felt 20 years of underground rage finally reach the surface, calm and total. I didn't yell. I just told her she would never be alone with my daughter again, that the visits were over, all of them, and I watched her reach for the script that always worked on me, the wounded martyr, the after everything I've done, and I let it bounce off, because the silence she'd built in me had also built something she never intended, a person who no longer needed her approval to exist. She left that afternoon. I thought that was the end of it. But 2 days later, a certified letter came from a lawyer, and my parents, it turned out, had been quietly preparing for months, long before this visit, to file for court-ordered grandparent visitation rights, which in our state are real, and they had a frightening amount of documentation, photos from holidays, records of every supervised visit, and they were seeking regular unsupervised access to Marin. And at the very bottom, in my father's handwriting, was a note that said, "We raised one quiet, respectful child. We intend to finish raising another. The hearing is set. You won't win." And I sat down at my table, the writer who'd been given 100 words a day, and I started, for the first time in 20 years, to write something for my daughter that had no limit and no mercy. And I had filled 4 pages when my phone rang, and it was a number from my parents' town, and a woman's voice I didn't recognize said, "You don't know me, but I was the babysitter your parents had after you left, and I just heard they're going after a grandchild. And there are things I saw in that house that a judge needs to hear, and I'm not the only one." Her name was Chaya, and she told me she had been 19 when my parents hired her, 2 years after I left home, and that she stayed for 2 years before she couldn't take it anymore. I gripped the phone so hard my fingers ached and just listened. "They had another girl they watched sometimes, a neighbor's kid," Chaya said, her voice steady but careful, like she had been waiting a long time to say this. "Your mom used the counter on her too." I quit when I found the notebook. I sat down on the floor of my kitchen because my legs weren't really working right. "What notebook?" I asked. There was a pause, and then Chaya said, "Your mom kept a log. Every word, every day. Dates, tallies, notes about what happened when kids went over. She still had yours in there. Pages and pages." I closed my eyes. It meant she wasn't just doing it out of habit. She believed in it enough to document it. She was proud of it. I thanked Chaya, took her number, and told her I would call her back. And then I sat there on the kitchen floor for maybe 10 minutes just breathing. Then I got up. Kirill had found a family lawyer the week before, and I called that office and explained everything. The word rule, the tally counter, the legal filing. The lawyer listened without interrupting, and then she said, "The grandparent visitation statute in your state is real and it is enforceable, but the burden is on your parents. They have to prove 2 things, that they have a meaningful existing relationship with your daughter, and that visitation serves the child's best interest." I felt a tiny bit of relief until she followed it with, "Do you have any evidence of harm?" And there it was, the question that made my chest tight, because I had my word. I had Marin's words from that phone call. I had 20 years of knowing exactly what my parents were, but a judge doesn't know me. A judge sees paperwork, and my parents had a lot of paperwork. I told the lawyer I would get evidence, and I meant it. That night I went to Marin's room. She was sitting at her little desk drawing something with a green crayon, her tongue poking out the side of her mouth the way it does when she's focused. I sat on the edge of her bed and asked, real gentle, what the days with grandma were like. Marin kept drawing. She didn't look up. She shrugged in that way kids do when they don't want to get someone in trouble but also don't want to lie. I waited. Eventually she put the crayon down and said, "Grandma said you used to be a good quiet girl, and that I could be one too if I tried." I kept my face still. Then Marin opened her desk drawer and pulled out a piece of paper and handed it to me, and I swear my heart stopped for a full beat. It was a chart. Across the top, in Hanako's neat handwriting, it said, "Marin's words for today." Below that were 100 small boxes, and every single one had a check mark in it. And at the very bottom was a frowny face drawn in red marker. 100 boxes, 100 words, the same number, the same system, handed to my daughter on a piece of paper like it was a game. I took out my phone and photographed the chart, and my hands were shaking so bad it took me 3 tries to get a clear picture. Then I asked Marin, keeping my voice soft, if grandma had said anything else. Marin looked at me with those big serious eyes and said, "She said if I was quiet enough, she'd tell me a secret about you, but I never got quiet enough." Something inside me broke and rebuilt itself in the same second. I pulled Marin into my lap and held her, and I told her, "There is no secret, baby. Grandma was wrong. You never, ever have to earn the right to speak. Your words are yours, and nobody gets to put a number on them." She leaned into me and said, "Okay, mommy," and then she told me about her drawing, which was a dragon who could talk to fish, and I listened to every single detail. I put her to bed and went to the kitchen table and laid everything everything out. The chart, the legal filing, Chaya's phone number, Gareth's handwritten note at the bottom of the filing. Kirill came home about an hour later. He set his keys on the counter and saw me at the table and saw what was spread out in front of me, and I watched him pick up Gareth's note and read it. His face went from tired to something harder. He put the note down and said, "They planned this. This wasn't a reaction to you cutting them off. They filed the paperwork before the visit." I nodded. The visit wasn't childcare, I told him. It was an audition. They wanted to show they could handle unsupervised time with her. They wanted to build their case. Kirill sat down across from me. He looked at the chart, at Marin's name written in my mother's handwriting, at the 100 little check marks and the frowny face. "They used our daughter as evidence," I said. The meeting with the lawyer was 3 days later, and it was the first time I felt truly scared. Not angry, not sad, scared. Because she spread my parents' filing across her desk and walked me through it piece by piece. Hanako and Gareth had photos from every holiday going back to Marin's first Christmas. They had a typed list of every single supervised visit, with dates, times, and little notes about what they did together. They had copies of birthday cards they'd sent, and receipts for every gift, every stuffed animal, every outfit. They had it organized in a binder with tabs. When she finished, she looked at me and said, "On paper, these look like devoted grandparents. A judge who doesn't know the history will see two elderly people being shut out by their daughter." I sat there staring at that binder, and I realized something that made me feel sick. My parents built this case the same way they built the silence. Slowly, one piece at a time, one visit documented, one photo saved, one receipt filed away. They didn't do it all at once. They did it over years, patient and careful. The same way they clicked that counter one word at a time until the number ran out. Control doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be steady. I drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for a while, and then I picked up my phone and called Chaya. She answered on the second ring, like she'd been waiting. I asked her straight out if she would be willing to testify. There was a long pause. Then she said, "I never reported it. I was 19. I didn't know what it was. I just knew something was wrong when a kid stopped talking. If she never reported it, my parents' lawyer could say she was making it up." I was about to thank her anyway and hang up when she said, "But I kept a journal. I wrote down what I saw because it bothered me. Dates, descriptions, things your mother said. I still have it." I pressed the phone harder against my ear. "You kept it?" "Because I knew someone would need it someday," Chaya said. "I just didn't know it would be you." That night, after Marin was asleep, I sat down at my desk to write my declaration for the court. This was supposed to be the thing I was good at. I started writing about the counter, about the consequences for going over 100, about the notebooks I filled because paper was the only place I was allowed to be unlimited. I wrote for 2 hours and then I read it back, and my whole body went cold. It sounded like a sad story. It read like a memoir, but it didn't sound like a legal argument. A judge doesn't need to feel sorry for me. A judge needs to see a pattern that is still active, still dangerous, still aimed at a child. I pulled open the drawer where I'd put Marin's word chart and laid it on the desk next to one of my old childhood notebooks, the ones I'd brought out of storage after the visit. I opened the notebook to a random page and there it was. Hanako's handwriting at the top, neat and small, logging my words for the day. And on the chart, Hanako's handwriting again, neat and small, Marin's words for today. Same slant, same careful letters, same little boxes, 20 years apart, 2 different children, the same system, written by the same hand. It wasn't a sad story anymore, it was a pattern. I started rewriting the declaration, this time connecting every piece of my childhood directly to what happened to Marin. Kirill came in around 2 in the morning. He read over my shoulder for a while, then he sat down and said, "You're holding back. You're writing this like you're afraid they'll read it and be hurt." I stopped typing. I could see it. Even now, I was softening it. 20 years of managing them was still in me. The counter was gone, but the habit wasn't. Kirill put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Write it like you're writing for Marin, not for them." So I deleted the whole thing and started over. 3 days before the hearing, I was in the kitchen making Marin's lunch when the mail came. There was a regular envelope mixed in with the junk. No return address. I recognized the handwriting. Gareth's. Small and sharp and slanted left. The same handwriting that used to label my childhood notebooks with my daily tally. I opened it standing at the counter. It was 1 page, handwritten. He said he was disappointed in me. He said I had been poisoned by modern nonsense. He said Marin would grow up loud and empty without structure. He said that a daughter who turns on her parents deserves what she gets. He signed it Dad. I read it twice. The first time I read it as his daughter, and it hurt the way it was designed to hurt. The second time I read it as a mother with a court date, and I saw it for what it was. Evidence. A man who believes a child's voice is something to be earned just wrote it down and mailed it to me. I slid the letter into the court file. My father had spent my whole life counting my words. He never thought to count his own. The night before the hearing, I read Marin a bedtime story. One of her favorites about a bear who builds a boat and sails to the moon. But when I closed the book, she didn't close her eyes. She looked up at me and said, "Mommy, am I going to have to go to Grandma's house?" I said no. I said it simply and clearly. But Marin wasn't done. She pressed her face into my sleeve and said, "She told me I would. She said a judge would make you let me come." I went very still. Hanako had looked at her during those 3 days and told her that a court of law would force her mother to hand her over. She had planted that in a child's head like a seed. I pulled Marin closer and held her against me and I said, "No one is going to make you be quiet. Not Grandma. Not a judge. Not anyone. You have my word." She nodded into my shoulder, and within a few minutes she was asleep. I tucked her in and went downstairs, and I knew I wasn't going to sleep. I pulled out the box of childhood notebooks from the hall closet. I sat on the living room floor and started reading. I opened one from when I was about Marin's age, maybe 8, and I read an entry written in careful round letters with a pencil that had been pressed hard into the page. "Today I used all my words by lunch. I had to be quiet for the rest of the day. I counted the birds outside because that was free. 7 birds. I read it 3 times. I remembered counting them. I turned more pages. Another entry a few weeks later. I wanted to tell Mom about my drawing, but I only had 4 words left, so I just showed it to her and she didn't look. I put the notebook down and pressed my hands over my face and cried. Then I wiped my face and picked up my phone and photographed every page. By morning I was calm. I had my declaration, rewritten and honest and sharp. I had Chaya's journal entries, which she had scanned and sent to the lawyer. I had Marin's word chart with the 100 boxes and the frowny face. I had the childhood notebooks. I had Gareth's letter. And I had the pre-filed paperwork with the dates that proved my parents had started building their case months before the visit. Kirill drove me to the courthouse. I sat in the passenger seat with the file folder in my lap. Then I looked over at him and said, "I spent my whole childhood learning to say everything that mattered in 100 words. Today I'm going to use as many as it takes." We pulled into the courthouse parking lot and walked through the front doors, and I saw them right away. Hanako and Gareth were standing in the hallway outside the hearing room. Hanako was dressed like she'd planned the outfit for weeks. A soft blue blouse, pearl earrings, her hair done just so. The picture of a sweet grandmother. Gareth stood beside her with his shoulders back. Hanako saw me and started walking toward us. She stopped a few feet away. "It's not too late," she said. "We can still be a family. Just let us see her. That's all we want." I said, "You had 3 days with her and you put a counter on her voice. That's not love. That's what you did to me." Hanako's face tightened. Then she found her response. "I made you strong," she said. "Look at you. You're a writer because of me." I held her eyes and said, "I'm a writer because the page was the only place you let me exist." About 10 minutes later, through the main entrance, Chaya walked in. She was holding a worn, soft-covered journal with a bent spine, gripping it the way I grip my notebooks when I'm nervous. She walked over and stopped in front of me and said, "I almost didn't come. I kept telling myself it wasn't my business. But then I thought about that little girl, and I thought about you, and I realized staying quiet is exactly what your parents would want me to do." I thanked thanked her. The hearing started, and my parents' lawyer went first. He walked the judge through everything in that binder, the photos, the visit logs, the birthday cards, the gift receipts. He described Hanako and Gareth as devoted grandparents who had been present for every milestone. Then our lawyer stood up. He didn't start with my story. He started with the chart. He held up the piece of paper Hanako had given Marin during those 3 days, and he read the title out loud. Marin's words for today. 100 boxes, checked. Frowny face at the bottom. He handed it to the judge, who looked at it for a long time. Then our lawyer presented my childhood notebooks, opening them to the pages where Hanako had logged my daily word count in the same neat handwriting, and he placed them beside the chart so the judge could see it. The same system, the same hand, spanning decades. He read the entry from when I was 8. Today I used all my words by lunch. I had to be quiet for the rest of the day. I counted the birds outside because that was free. 7 birds. The room went silent. Then Chaya was called. She walked to the front of the room holding her journal, and her voice shook when she started reading, but she didn't stop. She described showing up to babysit at my parents' house and finding Hanako in the kitchen with the tally counter, clicking it while a neighbor's child spoke, and she described that child sitting in a chair in the living room afterward, silent, staring at nothing, for hours. She described asking Hanako about it, and Hanako telling her, children need to learn that speech is a privilege, not a right. The judge asked her why she never reported it. Chaya looked down at her journal and then back up and said, because I didn't have a word for what it was. I just knew it was wrong. Our lawyer then held up Gareth's handwritten letter and read it to the room. He read, a daughter who turns on her parents deserves what she gets. And then he read the note from the original filing. We raised one quiet, respectful child. We intend to finish raising another. He let those words just sit there. Then he presented the dates on the filing paperwork, showing the petition had been started months before the babysitting visit. Then I was asked to speak. I stood up. I grew up counting every word, I said. I learned to make them matter because I had so few. My parents are asking this court for the right to do the same thing to my daughter. Every photo, every visit log, every birthday card was preparation for this room. They didn't build a relationship with Marin. They built a case. I paused. My daughter told me she used up her words. She is 7 years old. No child should ever believe their voice has a limit. Then Hanako was given her chance. She stood up and she was composed at first, speaking calmly about her philosophy, calling it old-fashioned but rooted in love. But the judge looked at her and asked directly, did you use a counting device to limit your granddaughter's speech during the visit? Hanako paused. Something moved behind her eyes, and then she said, I was teaching her, the way I taught her mother. And look at her mother. She's a published writer. She's successful. I did that. The silence made her who she is. The room went completely still. The judge said, you're telling this court that you deliberately restricted a 7-year-old's ability to speak, and you believe that was beneficial? And Hanako lifted her chin and said, yes, someone had to. The judge wrote something down. Gareth reached for Hanako's arm, but she shook him off. I had spent my whole childhood learning what words cost, and my mother had just spent hers for free. The judge denied the petition in its entirety. He said the evidence showed a pattern of emotional restriction that was not in the child's best interest, and that the grandparents' own testimony confirmed their intent to continue the practice. He recommended the file be forwarded for further review. Outside the courthouse, standing in the sun with Kirill beside me, I called Marin. She picked up on the second ring and immediately started talking, fast and breathless, about a caterpillar she'd found in the yard, how it was green and fuzzy and curled up on a leaf, and did I know caterpillars have 12 eyes, and could we keep it in a jar with holes in the lid? And she kept going, words tumbling over each other, endless. I listened to every single one. I didn't count. That night I opened a blank notebook, a new one, and I wrote on the first page, for Marin, so you always know, your voice was never the problem. Your voice was always the point. 2 weeks later, a small package arrived at my house. No return address. Inside was a composition notebook I had never seen before, cheap and soft-cornered. The cover faded the color of dust. The handwriting on the front was Hanako's, neat and small. The label said, Subject 4. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened it. The pages were laid out the same way as my old notebooks, with dates down the left side and tally marks beside them, but the name at the top of every page was not mine. It was a name I had never heard in my life. The first entry was dated 3 years before I was born. Tucked between the back pages was a folded sheet of yellowed paper. It was a copy of a hospital record from the same year as the first entry, listing the patient's age as 4 and the cause of admission in 2 words I had to read twice before I understood. Selective mutism. At the bottom of the page, in handwriting that was not Hanako's and not Gareth's, were 6 words. Ask your mother what happened to her sister.